Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Abby Robinson, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation on governing police use of force. This event is being held to mark the launch of a new publication from the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, or DCAF. The publication is a self-assessment guide for police organizations which focuses on strengthening governance of the use of force, an important and timely topic, and one you'll hear about in much more detail throughout today's event. In a moment, I'll hand it over to DCAF's director for opening remarks, but first, just a few administrative notes before we get started. We will have panel members speaking in English, French, and Spanish, so if you need interpretation, please be sure to select the appropriate language using that function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. The event today will be recorded and live streamed on YouTube as well. After opening remarks today, we'll have a brief presentation of the self-assessment guide, followed by a discussion with our panel of experts. We have a really excellent panel lined up today, and we're looking forward to hearing their insights and perspectives on this topic. And I will introduce our panel members and our presenters just a bit later. We'll also make sure there is time after the panel for questions from our audience, and so we would encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom throughout the event today, and we look forward to your participation. And with that, I am very happy now to be able to introduce Ambassador Nathalie Chouard, the director of DCAF. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, dear participants, dear colleagues. I am thrilled to be with you for the launch of the publication, Governance of the Use of Force, Police Self-Assessment Guide. As you know, DCAF aims at making states and people safer through good governance of the security sector and the development of effective, accountable security institutions which respond to the needs of the communities. For 24 years, we have supported our partners in developing laws, institutions, policies, and good practice, and provided capacity building to various actors, state, civil society, and private sector. We are also proud to have contributed with independent expertise and legal policy advice and innovative knowledge products. Police fulfill a fundamental role in society and are at the heart of this relationship between the state and communities. They are a visible embodiment of state legitimacy and ensure that democracy is preserved and human and civil rights are protected. At a time when democracy around the world faces major challenges and in which civic space is shrinking, the issue of police use of force deserves particular attention, since it is a factor that impacts trust and legitimacy. Whether in the context of demonstration or more routine police function, such as searches, seizure, or arrest, use of force has come under increased scrutiny. Citizens need to be confident that the institution responsible to enforce the law indeed observes the law, protects their rights, and is accountable for the way in which it fulfills the mission it has been entrusted. This requires a strong emphasis on respect of our human rights, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical part of an approach that ultimately keeps the communities and police safer. It also means embracing gender equality and developing an inclusive workforce that is well prepared to respond to the needs of all members of the society. Today, we are pleased to launch DCAF's new self-assessment guide on governance of police use of force. This is a practical tool designed to support police institutions in reflecting on and addressing challenges related to this crucial topic. The guide is part of a broader range of DCAF work that DCAF is doing in transforming approaches to police reform, focused on addressing the factors which shape individual and institutional behavior in a way that is people-centered. I am glad to mention here our long-standing work on police integrity and gender in policing, as well as very recently a research on the effects of the trauma and social norms on policing and the identification of key barriers to community access to police services. I very much look forward to our conversation today and to continuing working with you and our partners around the world in delivering effective, accountable security to all members of the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those opening remarks. And I think for placing today's discussion and indeed policing in this broader context of democratic governance, in which many stakeholders and really all of us have a role to play. And I think this is a theme that we'll return to throughout today's discussion. Next, we're going to turn to a brief presentation of the self-assessment guide. And so I would like to introduce our next speakers, who are the co-authors of this guide. Natalia Escobar is a program manager with DCAF who has supported various police institutions in modernization and strengthening governance. And Gary White is a senior expert in community policing, public order, human rights, the use of force, and police accountability. He served as a police officer for over 30 years in Northern Ireland and has extensive command experience. And since retiring, Gary has served as an advisor to a range of organizations, including the British Government Stabilization Unit, as well as Safer World, the OSCE, Amnesty International, and the United Nations. Natalia and Gary, over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Abby. First of all, please let me know if you can see my screen. Great. So, good day to our panel members. Good afternoon to those who are joining us from Europe and other parts of the world. Good morning to those in Latin America and North America. Thank you very much for your interest and participation at this event. So, we come here today to talk about police use of force. The police is a key institution for society. I think that we all agree on that. It's a building block for democracy and peace. However, police legitimacy is questioned all around the world. Many times, incidents related to the use of force, which unfortunately lead to eroding people's trust in police. Today, many voices actually disapprove of the use of force for the police, and we need to ask ourselves, what is the problem? I think that we all agree that there are some situations where it may be necessary for the police to intervene and eventually use force. But then why do so many people no longer see it that way? And what can be done in order to restore public trust and legitimacy? There is a lot of scrutiny, criticism, and theory around the issue of police use of force, but very little practical guidance. And this guide, this publication that we are presenting today, aims to fill that gap. In 2021, we launched the publication that you can see on the left. This publication, this document, provides a framework to approach and address the issue of the governance of use of force by the police. Today, we want to present a new publication that is a hands-on tool that is meant to be an enabler for police institutions around the world to take action to strengthen their use of force governance and ultimately their legitimacy. Both publications are structured around three main pillars: rule of law, resources, and accountability. In the guide, each of these pillars corresponds to a model, and the guide is designed in such a way that each police institution, according to its context, needs, and capabilities, can prioritize any of these models or carry out the whole complete assessment, which is ideal, but we understand that there are differences according to the context and the capabilities of each institution. These three pillars are crisscrossed by organizational culture, which is a critical aspect my colleague Gary will go through in a few minutes. The guide is a practical tool, as I mentioned, for police institutions to clearly and specifically identify the gaps, challenges, and opportunities for improvement in terms of the use of force. The idea is to collect information in a structured manner with a well-established purpose. This is exactly what will enable police institutions to address the issues and make tangible changes that the public can probably and surely see and recognize. It allows police institutions to move forward in the implementation of solutions and good practices without waiting for major reform process. And this marks an important difference from the material that exists today in terms of use of force, which is not a little. There is a lot of material out there, but this guide has a solution-oriented approach. While it doesn't provide any prescription because it's not a manual, it guides police through root causes and good practices. Now, what do I mean when I refer to a structured, purposeful information? Well, the information is collected around the three pillars I described: rule of law, resources, and accountability. And this collection of information and the assessment process has one purpose, and it's to create an action plan that generates changes and dynamics that strengthen the governance of the use of force, and in that way, strengthen legitimacy. So this is why you see in here this red circle, because this is the purpose of all of this, to create an action plan and really act on the findings that police may have. This guide also includes methodological recommendations for conducting the self-assessment and also for designing the action plan. But I think that the time today doesn't allow for that. I would prefer to give the floor to my colleague, Gary White, who will continue with the presentation. Thank you, Gary.
If you move to the next slide, please, Natalia. And the next one, you will.
Yes, sorry.
So I think what I'm going to try and do in the next couple of minutes is just give you a sort of an overview of the substance of the document. As you can see in front of you on the slide, we projected up a number of different functions of the police, things that the police are required to do. And in all of those functions, realistically, there is the possibility and the likelihood of the use of force. So in some respects, everything they do potentially involves the use of force. And one of the issues that we wanted to try and get across is that the idea is that citizens are often the beneficiary of such use of force. It's not only to be seen in a negative context, use of force by the police around providing protection and safety for people. But of course, people only really benefit from that use of force when it's used legitimately, when it's used proportionately, and also when it's only used strictly necessary, when it's strictly necessary to do so. But it's to sort of set the framework of the fact, recognizing that there is a requirement for police use of force. Next slide, Natalia. As Natalia mentioned, which is given an overview of how the document's structured, we have three sort of key pillars around rule of law, around resources, and around accountability. But sort of an overarching theme for our document was the influence of culture, organizational culture. And of course, that organizational culture can be either positive or negative. In a negative organizational culture, guidelines, policies, and training are going to fall short of regulating the behavior of police officers. I think it was George Kelly, the sort of leading American academic, that once said, the most determinant factor on the behavior of a police officer is likely to be the culture that they find themselves in. In other words, is the culture within the organization one, we sometimes hear of the blue wall of silence, where loyalty is valued over integrity, and where sometimes the police can very quickly be sucked into seeing this sort of idea of them and us, and no one understands it. These are symptoms, if you like, of a negative culture. Positive culture, on the other hand, is one that we want to encourage, based on values that are consistent with human rights principles, particularly around the use of force. And those are the foundation of governance, and not only that, of police legitimacy. And I'll come back to that issue in a few moments. So what are those sort of key principles? I'm sure many of the people in this webinar will be very familiar with these things. They're written in numerous laws, they're written in numerous policy documents, they guide training. But in some respects, this sort of belies the sort of the gap between policy and practice, what actually happens on the ground. So when we look at those principles, I mean, our focus is very definitely on the issue of accountability, because it's accountability that will inform a governance structure. The document is how we've written it, is intended to be adaptable. Adaptable, recognizing the point that Natalia made, that it should be applicable to different contextual and cultural contexts, different operational contexts. Some police organizations work in an environment where there's a high threat. Different organizational contexts. This should be applicable to very large organizations and also very small ones. We describe its approach as modular, in so much as I think Natalia talked about an overarching sort of systematic review, and the document will support that. But similarly, it will also support a much sort of shorter, sharper, perhaps when funding it doesn't support a wider operational review, to look at individual teams, to look at individual disciplines, or to look at things in a thematic way. We believe it's pragmatic and implementable. It effectively is a self-reflective tool. It doesn't have off-the-shelf solutions. Having said that, it's enriched by good practice, and it's enriched by the fact that we based this on an extensive consultation. We were assisted by experts from many different regions, many different continents, and also from many different disciplines, police oversight bodies, law enforcement themselves, and also policy writers. The way the document's structured is that the substance of it is around these three pillars. There's a chapter in relation to each of the three pillars of rule of law, resources, and accountability. And within each chapter, there is a narrative which sort of explains the key sections that you see in front of you now, sort of give some meat on the bones, if you like, to the issues that we're actually addressing. But in addition to that, each section then has an accompanying questionnaire, an example of which should be on the screen momentarily. Natalia? So even a quick glance at the questionnaire, you'll see that there's often a mixture of open and closed questions. The questionnaires are not providing the off-the-shelf answer. What they'll do on occasions is to signpost to good practice. But the real purpose is as a self-reflective tool, effectively a mirror to hold up. If you're through one of these questionnaires and the answer is always predominantly in the negative, no, that you don't have these various tools that the questionnaire is prompting you towards, then perhaps you have some questions to ask, and this then helps to inform your action plan as to how you go and address those issues. The final slide, and I was delighted to hear the ambassador talk in her opening remarks about this idea of legitimacy, and I think she termed it trust, because ultimately what we're talking about here, as Natalia said, is an issue which is controversial, and perhaps becoming more controversial around the police use of force. The police have a monopoly in most societies on the use of force. So therefore, it's even more incumbent on the police to ensure that their use of force is done properly and in a way that enhances their legitimacy. Because the little model on the bottom right-hand corner links those three concepts of legitimacy and public confidence, or trust, with the police effectiveness. Without legitimacy, the police cannot hope to develop trust and confidence of communities. And without that, the police will just simply cease to be effective, therefore further undermine legitimacy. So this can either be a vicious cycle or a virtuous one. We hope and we commend the document to you as a contributory factor in hopefully securing that virtuous circle of building the police legitimacy and developing trust. So thank you.
Many thanks, Gary and Natalia, for that excellent overview, which I think is really a great starting point as well for our panel discussion, which is now going to go more deeply into some of the challenges and tensions that surround implementation of some of the principles that you've outlined in the presentation, and certainly also in the guide as well. So next, I'd like to introduce our panel members for today. Alejandro Lanz Sanchez is a lawyer and co-executive director of the organization Temblores, which is an NGO in Colombia. He's worked in civil society organizations defending the human rights of the LGBTI community, sex workers, street dwellers, drug users, and people who are victims of police profiling and also deprived of their liberty. During his career, he's built strategic community litigation to defend the fundamental rights of communities whose rights have been historically breached. Christine Fossen is the head of the police component in the United Nations mission in South Sudan. She's held a number of high-ranking posts during her more than 30-year career in the Norwegian police, including Deputy Police Commissioner, Chief of the Organized Crime Unit, and Head of the Admissions Board at the Norwegian Police College. Her international experience also includes serving as head of mission for the temporary international presence in Hebron in Palestine. Louise Edwards is the Director of Research and Programs for the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum in South Africa. She has extensive experience working on police reform and oversight with actors including national human rights institutions, independent police oversight authorities, and civil society. Louise has developed guidance and standards related to the prevention of torture and arrest and custody, public order policing, and she also works on other issues which fall at the intersection of development, poverty, and justice. Mark Croker is senior partner of Croker Partners, LLC, and served for over 30 years as a police officer in the United States, including as deputy chief of the Los Angeles Police Department and police chief in Portland, Oregon. Mark also served as Deputy Police Commissioner for the United Nations mission in Bosnia, Police Commissioner for the UN mission in Liberia, and Police Advisor in the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And he's also supported police reform in countries including Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And Mr. Mehdi Karkas is Police Commissioner from Morocco. He holds a degree in private law from the Faculty of Legal, Economic, and Social Sciences at Mohammed Agdal University in Rabat, and he was recruited by the Directorate General of National Security as a police officer, then assigned as an investigator in the Provincial District of Tamara. He was also promoted to the rank of Police Commissioner in 2020 and now serves as head of the Tourist Brigades Department at the Public Security Directorate. So a warm welcome to all of our panel members. Very much looking forward to our discussion today. And to kick off that discussion, Mark, I'd like to turn to you first. You have extensive experience as a police leader and working specifically on use of force, having served on a board that was responsible for reviewing incidents of use of force. So I'd like to ask if you can tell us what you see as the main challenges when it comes to governing police use of force.
Well, there are many, Abby, and thank you for including me in this panel. There are many challenges, but one of the challenges that I see as predominant is the issue of synchronizing the policy with the procedure. In other words, what is written is that what is done? And that's not a criticism on those that are the doers, but sometimes it's actually on the policy. I was in a very heated debate one time on the subject of vehicular pursuits. It was defined as a use of force, and I was told by the person on the other lectern that you and the LAPD, you have three policies. You know, the one that's in your manual, the one that supervisors talk about, and the one that's actually done. And I protested a little bit, but I thought, well, in a way, that's right, because you know, you can't write yourself with policy out of the problem of use of force. The practicality of being on the ground is different from the very technical way that you write a policy in a manual or a special order, general order. And so to me, the challenge is to synchronize what is being done with what is written, with what is being emphasized in the command structure of the organization. And then to bring those three together is the main challenge. That requires command emphasis, it requires significant communication, but it also requires a careful review of the policies to make sure that they are actually practically applicable, so that they're not unreasonably stated. So a police officer on the street can actually understand what is written so that the supervisors can communicate what is to be done and the officers on the ground can do what they should be doing. That establishes then there's no gap in public perception of the legitimacy of the use of the police force.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for the emphasis on, as we also heard from Natalia and Gary, practical application of these rules on the ground where, members of the police have to make split-second decisions in difficult situations. So thank you. Christine, I'd like to turn to you next for your perspective, and ask you, based on your experience as a police leader, both at home and abroad, and currently in a UN peacekeeping operation, what elements do you think are most important in governing police use of force?
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. And let me just start off by saying that I totally agree with what Mark said, and I'll try to work on my comments in his perspective so I don't echo him. But the most important thing is the legal framework. We need a legal framework around everything that the police is entitled to do or not to do, and it also which should be in the legal framework, and then you have to have guidance, and then you have to have the policies, and you have incorporated in this. Of course, you have to have the international standards and the human rights included, and the respect for those. So it's all in the legal framework, but then. It's not only the framework, but it is, as Mark very clearly said, the police officers on ground has to understand and what kind of guidance do they have and what is the legal framework they're operating under. That's why training is so important. Selection and training over and over again on the use of force, but what is the alternative of use of force? And what is use of force? Use of force is not only the use of weapon or the use of arresting people, but also detaining people. I mean, detaining people when you borderline. We have discussed this a lot in the Norwegian police. I'm a lawyer myself. I have never been a patrolling officer, but we even discussed with the lawyers. It is kind of a misuse of force to keep people in custody, which you are not, even though it's according to the law. But if you're quite sure this case will not take us anywhere, you should let them go. That's also a use of force. But going to what people think about use of force, training, and also the selection process. And also to be sure that you have proper training, which training is not only the use of force, but it's also to prevent the use of force. So how do you train, and also how do you educate the police officers in community policing, in engaging in the communities? How do you, as a patrolling officer or a police officer on a big demonstration, how do you engage in before the demonstration takes place? And maybe I can come back to this, but in Norway, we have developed a concept of how we use dialogue as a tool instead when we know big demonstrations will take place or big events will take place where the crowds might be not very nice to each other, or they will we are fearing tensions. Then the police officers, a certain group of people, will reach out. They're pre-selected and very well trained on how to use dialogue and to start to discuss with the demonstration or the political activists or whoever's going to come. And then they use this dialogue as a method to try to prevent anything from happening. At the end of the day, I must say we have in Norway, so far, we're probably not going to last forever, but we are still on daily duty. We don't have arms, but they have access to their weapons in the car. So it's very easy to arm the police if it's needed. And we see more and more because of the security situation, because of the increase of organized crime. We see that for long periods, the Norwegian police force are carrying their guns 24/7, as in many other countries. Lastly, I would like to say that also, and that's very different when we see what's happening in the US and other places. In Norway, you have a 3-year academy of, you get a bachelor degree in the police academy. So you spend 3 years in training before you're allowed out on the streets, being a traffic officer, an investigator, whatever. There's one education for all police officers. But I'll stop there. I'll come back to both the importance of training and the framework later on. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Christine, also for the insights around alternatives, presenting alternatives and making sure that those are also part of training when you think about use of force. So next, I'd like to turn Commissioner Karkas to you, and we've been talking about the importance of human rights as part of this framework. It's also central to good governance of the security sector. And so I'd like to ask you, from your experience in Morocco, what do you see as the main elements that police should be considering in order to ensure that their practices on use of force are well aligned with human rights and other international standards? The floor is yours. Commissioner Karkas, please go ahead if you can hear us. And we are unfortunately not hearing your.
Malheureusement, on ne vous entend pas. Semblerait qu'il y ait un problème avec son micro.
Could I ask you to try one more time, Commissioner, to speak, and otherwise perhaps.
Una vez más. Y si no, le podríamos dar un par de minutos para que pueda solucionar su problema y después lo volvemos a traer al caso.
Unfortunately, I think this is still not working. Let me suggest, Commissioner, that we come back to you, give you a moment to sort out the technical difficulties, and in the meantime.
Régler les difficultés techniques pendant l'instant, je vais passer à Luis.
And let you share some insights, I think, from the perspective of someone who has deep expertise in oversight, external oversight of policing. From your perspective, having heard from some of our experienced police officers, can I ask you to talk about what you see as the main challenges or obstacles to governing police use of force?
Thanks very much, Abigail, and to the colleagues at DCAF for the invitation to be here. So in terms of looking at this issue from an entry point of oversight, I'm going to be echoing to an extent the comments already offered by both Mark and Christine. So I think we're very much on the same page. And I was thinking about it in terms of two entry points, the first being the law, and then the second being that issues around police instructions and training. On the law issue, when it comes to oversight, what we're essentially trying to measure is the extent to which the police have complied with the legal framework governing the use of force. So where you have very permissive legal frameworks that don't accord with international standards, we're not only enhancing that risk of inappropriate use of force, but we're also undermining efforts of oversight structures to respond to both individual situations as well as systemic challenges. And where national frameworks do fall short, particularly in the context of lethal force, which is an area in which we engage at the most, oversight can become hamstrung because they're essentially limited to making recommendations within that existing framework or those recommendations for reform of the law to align with international standards. And with the issue of legal frameworks, it's not just in terms of the way in which force is being used, or the articulation of a framework for the use of force, but it's also around the extent to which the legislative framework itself explicitly recognises the role of oversight in the use of force management. So in an ideal world, all police agencies would be subject to internal and external oversight. But where we see legal frameworks around policing, and particularly those that deal with the use of force, that don't make that explicit link to which oversight authorities, which oversight agencies, internal, external, do operate in that context, we see challenges. So there really needs to be clear requirements for things such as cooperation, notification of incidents, review of policing laws, procedures, human resourcing, procurement and budgets. It's got to be not just incident response, but looking at the frameworks within which police are given to use force. And it also speaks to, which I'd like to talk a bit about later, that question of police culture, and that reiteration through the inclusion of oversight in core statutory structures, that oversight and accountability is a core component of the overarching policing project, not just an afterthought, or not just something that kind of sits there that we've got to tolerate, but that sits outside of policing values and practices. And then the second is just around that issue of instruction and equipping. So we've heard a little bit already about that issue of policing culture. And just to mention here, where there's an absence of oversight, we often see then impunity, particularly in terms of instructions around use of force. That issue of police training, which Christina's already covered. And then finally, in that context where you're policing in environments where there's often high rates of violent or organised crime, or very low tolerance for public demonstrations or gatherings, being sort of two environments where we see the use of force, convincing police to take precautious, proportionate and rights-based approaches to the use of force can be very unpopular. And so that's where issues around training, issues around embedding oversight as part of policing practice can become very important for trying to change that narrative.
Great, thanks so much, Louise. And I really appreciate what you said about seeing oversight as an integral part of the policing effort and policing project, and also this emphasis on context and how context, can fundamentally affect how some of these issues unfold. So with that, Commissioner Karkas, I'd like to come back to you, and I hope we can hear you now, and ask again, if you could share with us from your experience in Morocco, what do you think are the main elements that police really need to consider when aligning use of force practices with human rights and other international standards? So over to you, the floor is yours.
Ok, merci. Maintenant, vous m'entendez? Donc, ok, merci. Donc, pour répondre à cette problématique, il faut premièrement signaler que l'usage de la force par les agents de police au Maroc ne peut en aucun cas être fait hors de la loi. C'est la première chose. Au Maroc aussi, toute personne.
In Morocco, everyone has their own rights and public liberties that are guaranteed by the Constitution, the text and the law that are in force, and the importance of public liberties that constitute the legal framework regarding liberties and of association and gathering and public manifestations. And also the police officers are always in the obligation to respect the legal dispositions that are present also in international conventions that have been ratified by the Morocco. The use of force in the case of need, taking into consideration the principle of proportionality, because the main objective of the operation in Morocco is to disperse them, to reestablish public order and protect the physical integrity of individuals and their well-being. We also need to point out that the agents that have been in the case of in keeping order have always been made aware of their responsibility when it comes to the nature of their mission and the measures to take in the different situations that may arise. Insisting on the point of the gradual use of force in the case of need, I would like to highlight the point of need. Actually, the most known case and with the forces of order are called to use the force are in the case of dispersing manifestations in the public areas. So which the police agents who have the authority that say they are people that are manifesting that in the case there's vandalism in public areas. This dispersion are done in a logistic way, and tools made available for agents that they have the duty to protect. Regarding the framework using gunfire arms, the elements of forces of order must be done in the framework of managing these events and manifestations. We also regarding what has to do with the training of police officers, managing manifestations or public event. When we have do particularly on peaceful management of demonstrations and introducing them to the legislative or legal frameworks of human rights. Within the topics, we also cover use of force according base need, and also regarding proportionality, as well as the execution of practice of exercises regarding peacekeeping or maintaining order, as well as keeping calm in face of situations that may call to the use of force. Finally, during my intervention, I would also like to ensure the compliance with human rights and practices, and also rationalize the use of force and use it only if there is need, following a group of measures, including negotiation, activating channels of communication with people, managing demonstrations, as well as the respect of legal considerations that also address the management of public demonstrations. The principle of proportionality in the use of force, taking into consideration the seriousness of this case, if this calls for it or not, the use of materials, logistics materials, allowing to disperse the people doing the demonstration without the use of force. These are some of the different acts or activities that we use, and this is the point I would like to do in my intervention. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much for those insights. And I think for, again, this emphasis on proper preparation of police for their duties, you know, on reminding them of their responsibilities, you know, and the role they play in protection as well. So thank you very much. I'd like to turn back now to this question of the role of oversight actors. And Alejandro, I'd like to turn to you next. You know, you've done some very interesting and unique work, I think, with the police in Colombia. And so I'd like to ask if you can tell us a little bit about your current work supporting the transformation of the Colombian National Police, and if you could maybe share any insights related to practices that you think have been effective in reducing police violence.
Hola, bueno, espero que me escuchen ahí todas las personas. Muchas gracias por la invitación y muchas gracias por la presentación del documento. Primero que todo, pues me gustaría contextualizar un poco sobre Colombia. Nosotros en Colombia tenemos una de las policías que está arraigada al Ministerio de Defensa. Es el único país latinoamericano cuya policía pertenece aún al Ministerio y la cartera de guerra de la Defensa. Nuestra Constitución dice que la policía debe ser un cuerpo civil, pero pese a eso permanece aún en la cartera de la guerra, digamos. Y esto se ve reflejado en el espacio público y en la calle, en la forma en la que la policía interactúa con la ciudadanía. La fuerza pública es una, digamos, de las caras más visibles del Estado, y por medio de la presencia de los cuerpos policiales en la calle, en el territorio geográfico, digamos, es la forma en la que el Estado demuestra el dominio territorial, y eso es lo que refuerza, digamos, de alguna manera la soberanía de un país. Y esa presencia de esos grupos armados en el espacio público es ante todo, por un lado, alegórica y performática. pues desencadena en las ciudadanías, en las emociones de la gente, pues toda una serie de cosas que no son gratuitas y que además están dictadas y según nosotros hemos determinado e investigado por una serie de prejuicios institucionales. Entonces, esta dimensión performativa de los cuerpos policiales y de ese efecto tranquilizador que genera en unas ciudadanías, genera miedo en otro tipo de ciudadanías. Es decir, es distinto cómo la policía va clasificando en el espacio público a las ciudadanías de bien y a quienes debe proteger, y a estas ciudadanías les genera un efecto tranquilizador, ¿sí? Es decir, una ciudadanía a la que la policía lee como un ciudadano de bien, a esta ciudadanía le genera un efecto tranquilizador. Y hay otro tipo de ciudadanos y de ciudadanías a las que la policía les genera un gran temor. Y ese gran temor infundado, digamos, por parte de ciertos grupos sociales, como las personas LGBTI, las personas trabajadoras sexuales, habitantes de calle, jóvenes en riesgo de exclusión social, es un prejuicio institucional que no corresponde, digamos, a criterios objetivos, sino corresponde completamente a una clasificación subjetiva arraigada en el prejuicio institucional que viene, digamos, desde hace mucho tiempo dentro de las instituciones policiales en el mundo. Y un poco el trabajo que nosotros hemos venido haciendo desde nuestra organización, que se llama Temblores ONG, es tratar de documentar esas prácticas específicas que comete de violencia policial la policía contra ciertos grupos sociales. Y también hemos tratado de diseñar reformas, pequeñas reformas internas, que no necesariamente atraviesan, digamos, el cuerpo policial, pero que sí cambian y tratan de cambiar la interacción policial con estos grupos ciudadanos. Uno de estos ejemplos importantes en Colombia es cómo logramos probar que la ausencia de baños públicos en el espacio, o sea, el hecho de que no existan baterías sanitarias en la calle, se convertía en un motor de violencias policiales contra los habitantes de calle. ¿Por qué? Porque las personas habitantes de calle eran sorprendidas realizando sus necesidades fisiológicas en el espacio público, porque no existen baños públicos, y eso empezaba a generar una interacción policial. Y esa interacción policial muchas veces, y en la gran mayoría de los casos que documentamos, desencadenaban en violencia. En solo un año, en tan solo un año, nuestra organización documentó 7 homicidios policiales cometidos por personas, policías contra habitantes de calle, cuando estaban realizando sus necesidades fisiológicas en el espacio público. Entonces, una de las apuestas que nosotros tenemos es que entre más regulemos estos comportamientos y evitemos esas interacciones policiales, como por ejemplo las prohibiciones absolutas sobre el trabajo sexual, las persecuciones sobre estos grupos sociales, vamos a lograr que la policía sea menos violenta contra estas categorías vulnerables. Ese es uno como de los trabajos que hemos venido haciendo nosotros en el paro nacional del año 2021. Tuvimos 3 meses de movilización social que se tornó violenta en muchísimos casos. Hicimos un ejercicio de documentación de las violencias homicidas, físicas y sexuales. Y otro de los problemas más grandes que existen dentro del sistema es la falta de justicia en los casos de violencia sexual, homicida y física cometidos presuntamente por la policía. ¿Por qué? Porque la administración de estos casos está en cabeza de los, como les contaba, de las justicias penales militares, en donde la impunidad alcanza unos niveles muy grandes y las víctimas no tienen acceso, digamos, a un sistema de restauración, reparación y de no repetición contra estos grupos sociales. Entonces yo creo que construir documentos como el que nos acaban de presentar, en donde les permiten a las policías realizar sus propios ejercicios de contabilidad y de rendirle cuentas a la ciudadanía, es uno de los ejercicios más importantes que puede hacer, digamos, a nivel interno de las policías, porque no existe, digamos, hoy en día en Colombia muchos mecanismos que le permitan a la policía rendir cuentas ante la ciudadanía. Y así también nosotros hemos venido pues documentando otros tipos de prácticas con otros grupos sociales que espero podérselos contar más en las próximas intervenciones, pero otro de los temas que también estamos trabajando y que creemos que contribuiría a la reducción de la violencia policial es la descriminalización del uso y el porte de sustancias. Y ahí es donde también el control político entra a jugar un papel muy importante, porque, por ejemplo, ahorita alcaldes y gobernadores que acaban de estar estrenando su cargo, están dictando disposiciones para perseguir el porte y el uso de sustancias en el espacio público, lo cual implica que la policía tiene que ponerse en el espacio público y en las calles a buscar a través de requisas y de perfilamientos y prejuicios de cómo aparenta la gente a partir de cómo está vestida la población, a buscar pequeñas dosis de sustancias de droga en los bolsillos de la ciudadanía. Y nosotros en Colombia pues tenemos un uso y un porte protegidos por la Constitución, y lo que hacen los alcaldes locales es determinar toda la fuerza pública a perseguir este comportamiento, lo cual tiene unas implicaciones muy graves en varias escalas. Por un lado, es porque la policía no puede estar encargada de lo que debe estar haciendo, y es perseguir el hurto y el homicidio y otros crímenes más grandes, y está dedicada a buscar, digamos, de bolsillo en bolsillo cómo cumplir con una política criminal más macro. Entonces, para resumir un poco, parte de los problemas que nosotros hemos venido identificando es que la policía tiene una gran cantidad de funciones que no debería corresponderle. Digamos, hay un montón de cosas que la policía tiene que hacer en el espacio público y no le alcanza, digamos, para cumplir con las políticas de seguridad a las que debería estar, digamos, más enfocada. Y otro de los temas en términos de justicia que no existen es un sistema pues de transparencia y de justicia en donde las víctimas puedan acudir a la justicia, adquirir reparación y no repetición de estas violencias. Dejaría ahí por ahora.
Many thanks, Alejandro. You know, I know your organization has done some important work documenting, you know, instances of abuses, and as you emphasize, you know, really focusing in particular on vulnerable communities, and that's an important role that civil society plays in this space. So thanks for that, and the emphasis on transparency as well. I think staying with this theme of the role of oversight actors, Louise, I'd like to turn back to you and ask, in your experience, you know, what is needed to ensure that oversight is truly effective in holding police institutions accountable, and also, you know, going back to what you said earlier, supporting changes in behavior and even culture where that may be needed?
Yeah, thanks, Abigail. I think there's sort of two ways to come at that question. One is more philosophical, and then the other one is quite practical. But starting with the philosophical, so my overarching reflection on this is that if you're looking for changes in behavior and culture, it goes back to the point I made earlier, that behavior and culture itself within the police needs to accept the role of oversight and accountability as part of as a fundamental part of policing practice. So often changes to strengthening oversight at a national level is usually done in response to situations that have either threatened or eroded the legitimacy and trust, not only in the police, but in the state. And particularly the police is often the most visible manifestation of the coercive power of the state. And then this is often then coupled with broader security sector and governance reform. So we've seen that a lot on the African continent. So for example, in South Africa, as part of the democratic transformation of policing from apartheid regime policing, effect was given to police accountability in the new South African constitution. And similarly in Kenya, there were wide-ranging reforms to the police to respond to broader issues of governance following the 2007 post-election violence. And in both situations, it resulted in the establishment of these independent statutory oversight mechanisms. So the point with that, though, is that while the system change is good, the reforms are usually externally driven, and they're not always at the impetus of the police organizations themselves. So you can change the constitution, you can change the law, you can bring these oversight mechanisms into being, but affecting and changing police behavior and culture, as we've unfortunately seen to an extent in South Africa and Kenya, is certainly another consideration. But then moving to the more practical, one of the most determinant factors for me, aside from looking at how systems of oversight are internally digested by police organizations as that fundamental part of policing practice, is how good your systems of oversight are. And I use that word systems quite deliberately because it requires an architecture. And the system has to acknowledge that police oversight on the use of force, on any form of policing practice needs to happen at multiple levels by multiple actors, each with their own role. And the roles need to include what we would call before the fact oversight. So it's things like the roles of Parliament in establishing the legal frameworks. And then it's the after and the budgetary issues, particularly around use of force and procurement of equipment. Then the second is that after the fact oversight. So that's that more responsiveness. And at a minimum, you need internal police oversight systems that work. But the best practice here, and we're seeing it begin to spread across Africa, is these independent statutory oversight mechanisms. And they ideally should be established in law, have functional independence, be sufficiently resourced, and have a good working relationship with the police. And there's no reason why that relationship needs to be antagonistic. But one thing that we've seen in, for example, Sierra Leone, is it being quite upfront in terms of articulating roles and mandates when notification needs to be given, control of crime scene, the requirement of cooperation, and what to do in terms of responses to recommendations and findings of oversight. Having those set out, clearly articulated and well understood by police political leadership as well as by rank and file, can begin to sort of unpack some of those culture and trust issues. And then finally, just to note that we work on the African continent in very resource-constrained environments. So one factor of oversight, and where oversight can be quite useful, is not just in terms of incident response and that kind of after the fact oversight, but looking at data collection and understanding where the weak points are in terms of policing practice and abiding by the legal framework, and doing more systemic and kind of overarching investigations and recommendations. And those can be not just focused in on individual incidents, but the police, sort of the structures in terms of the way in which operations are managed, the way in which the legal framework creates that enabling environment, and issues around budgeting and equipping. And so there's a lot of useful ways in which oversight can play a role in terms of supporting a more effective use of force. But it really is going to require both that acceptance of the role of oversight, as well as clear guidance around what oversight means and the cooperation that's required from the police. Thanks, Abigail.
Thanks a lot, Louise. And thanks for the emphasis also on the, the need for a good and productive working relationship. And to build on that, Mark, I want to come back to you. I know you have a lot of experience also working at, I guess, what I would describe as sort of an intersection of perspectives, the police, communities, the media. So I'm wondering if you could share with us any lessons you've learned throughout your career on how you can communicate effectively with different stakeholders, including oversight actors, on what can really be a polarizing topic. And maybe as part of that, is there anything that you think police really wish that external stakeholders, whether communities or oversight actors, understood better or differently about how they use force? So over to you.
Thank you, Abby. Well, at this point, and listening to my fellow panelists and over many, many years in policing, listening to the various commentators and so forth, the various words that are used, oversight and accountability and transparency and proportionality. These are terms often used by academics and by contributors, by legal people and so forth. And sometimes I think it's important for those of us in police leadership to take off the hat of police leadership and put on the hat of being a police officer. What about me, they would say. I face violence on the street. Do we understand what violence is? Do we know what it is to be personally attacked? Some of us have put handcuffs on people. We take away their basic freedom. Yeah, and not everybody wants their freedom taken away. And so there's violence with that. The law says you have committed this offense. You've attacked somebody violently. Now I, a police officer, am taking you into custody and the person doesn't want to go and will exercise violence. So violence is something that not everyone understands. when an incident occurs, when police use force, deadly force, or physical force, it is an incident that is a moment that takes place. And when later we try to explain this to why this happened, sometimes the legal profession advises us, well, yeah, be careful for what you say, because you know this is an investigation, and the officers told to be quiet. The agency is kind of goes into isolation on it. But outside, the social media erupts. News media have their predispositions, and they'll produce their stories about it, and anecdotes and narratives are spun and about what really happened. What really happened is not all that well known. So when an incident occurs, it's too late to communicate. And in my experience over all these years, I've never been an academic, I've never been a politician or a news media person, so maybe I don't understand that role either, or even a lawyer. But the role that I understand is what it's like to be under scrutiny, having been involved in the use of force. And as an agency head, or even one who has helped in developing policing around the world, in Africa and Europe and so on. When an incident occurs, it's too late to communicate about that, because the narrative that is sometimes spun is a false narrative based on social media. We fall into anecdotalism, you know, an incident happened, therefore all police are that. And I'm a police officer. Why are people telling me that I'm a bad person because this bad incident happened? And so the anecdotalism, as opposed to empiricism, happens. But when an incident occurs, it's really too late to communicate to a community, to the news media, what violence is like. And so one of the things that I tried to practice in the early on is to bring communities, news media people, politicians, special interest groups, to bring them in early and to communicate what it's like out here and what the laws that we face, what the policies that we have, and then people understand what it's like to be inside the organization, what that culture really means, and the heart of a police officer. What is there? Is that a malignant heart, or is that a service heart? You know, are these good people, or are they harmful people? And this oversight and accountability and all these things that we say about you know, culture, that needs to be communicated more broadly, so that people understand what it is like to be out there on the street early. So then an incident happens, and somebody, for example, we had a Citizens Police Academy, we call it. Later we call it, you know, Community Police Academy, because we had not necessarily citizens involved in it, migrants and so forth that were involved in that. We brought people in and we explained what is going on, why do we do things, what are our policies, and people went out in the community, and after many iterations of the police academy, we'd have incidents like people would tell us, well, I was at my hairdresser's and somebody said, did you see that later shooting and the bad police? And wait a minute, I was in the Citizens Police Academy. I can explain to you, you know, the news media, sometimes they get a little myopic, and they get a predisposition with a story, and they spin the story, and the police just shake their head, and on behalf of them, they say, oh man, I wish people understood. And so I think the intersection that you speak about, Abby, is the intersection between reality and you know, communicated event. So bringing that together is a huge challenge for those of us who've actually had to put handcuffs on people and say, I'm taking your freedom, and the person saying, no, you're not. And that's violence. And violence is something that not everyone understands. And those of us who've been attacked, I have a part of a tooth missing from having gone through a personal attack on myself. And those of us who've been there know what that's like. And so I'll end it with the idea that you know, in law enforcement, I think we have a lot of people coming at us, telling us what we should be, but little opportunity to explain who we are and how we actually operate, and the law, the policy, and the procedures, and the culture of the organization. We need to communicate. Those of us in law enforcement need to communicate more clearly. And as I've worked in Africa and Europe and other places, I've stressed the importance of communicating the internal, the way it is like on the street. That is an important thing. That's where the intersection comes together on the street. Back to you, Abby.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks for the emphasis really on, by the time an incident occurs, it's too late. And so I think that echoes what Louise was saying about before the fact oversight, really building relationships among different actors in the system so that there's some appreciation for the different roles and responsibilities, before things become controversial or conflictual. So thanks a lot for that. Christine, I want to come back to you now. We've talked a lot about, I think, some of the key principles in security sector governance as they apply to police use of force. Accountability and transparency have come up quite a bit, but there are other qualities and values we haven't talked about yet, or as much. Things like the importance of having a police institution that is inclusive and that is responsive and able to meet the needs of different members of society. So I'm curious, in your experience, do you think that gender plays a role in police use of force? And if so, how?
Well, thank you. And thank you for the question. Yes, I do think gender plays an important part. And from my experience from Norway, we right now we are about 50% women or females at the police academy. We don't really see the effect because in the police force or service in Norway, there's still about 35% females. And many of the women, and we have discussed it. I am one of many. I've been a police commissioner for more than 20 years, and we have discussed this over and over again. Why does women or females want to go to softer positions than being on patrol or being operative? And it seems, and I'm one of those who believes that this is a choice the ladies have to do themselves. We can ask them, why you want to leave the patrolling, or after, especially this occurs, especially after women get children. But it will be interesting to see how this affects the police, because sometimes we see that women, especially on the streets, have a softer approach. Not always, but sometimes they have the softer approach to go into dialogue with communities, work with the young ones, and to also, I think it has had a great effect on sexual gender-based violence, or understanding the effects of those kind of criminalities. So of course it does have an effect. On the other hand, I'm being a female myself and being always working for gender equality. It's also important that I think Mark stresses law enforcement is law enforcement, regardless of gender. You have to play the role. So I think that, or not even play the role, be the police officer, fulfilling your duties, and you need to. That's why I think gender, or the balance, I just lost the word, the balance of men and women, different ethnic groups, different ages is, if you combine the diversity of police officers, you will get better solutions, because if you're going to work with the culture, and I very much agree with what has been said about culture. This is an important, you can have all the good guidance and all the legal framework, but you also need to work with the culture. How do we do things? How do we follow the guidance? How do we in our unit operate? How do we approach human rights? How do we approach different ethnic groups? How do we approach the young ones or whatever? So I do think gender is important. Diversity is also very important, but within the framework of the police. And I just want to say that I fully agree and follow what Mark has said. And I just want to say, because I've not been a patrolling officer, but I've been in court many times being a prosecutor, sending people into jail for long sentences if that's been needed, and if they're found guilty. But Mark, I would like to say I have always seen it as my most important task, being a police commissioner for so long and coming from the university, being an academic. I have always, once or twice a year, made sure I have been on patrols. I have been with the most operative guys out there at nighttime, seen what they do to follow them. I've been on all kinds of trainings within the police districts where I've been a police commissioner. I have followed them on the shooting range, discussed with them, this is the guidance, this is the framework. And I've always been sure that I tell them that as long as you go along with the framework and the guidance, I will always support you, because you have to have as a police commissioner, your operative guys who are standing there as Mark said, in a split second, they have to take a decision, or if to use weapon or not, if to use force or not. And sometimes I have seen it so many times, how a situation can escalate, and then suddenly, boom, you have to do something. And they have to be trained on how they shift these mechanisms. But they also, their bosses, like Mark very correctly said, if you're going to be a responsible leader, you have to at least understand, even though I've never been on the street, I have discussed so much and engaged myself. So I built trust within the organizations I have been, that their police commissioners has understood these difficult decisions, and you need to have a framework, which is, they have to manage with the framework they have. They have to manage with the guidance. You cannot put expectations in the framework or in the guidelines, which is not possible to cooperate with. So I think that has been some of the lessons I have learned when discussing with the oversight, when we have cases that go wrong, and these oversight guys come and ask you, and they said, Christina, you cannot, have you seen your framework for patrolling, or your framework for operations for the central, the 24 operative central? And then they made me aware, you cannot, this is not, you put your officers in a place where they're not even able, because of the workload or the phones coming in or whatever is happening, that they're not able to comply. That's also a lesson learned, which I have really brought with me to UN, because we have a really heavy guidance framework, but it has to be possible to at least go along with it. And that's but now I talked a long way about gender. Gender
very
is
good
important.
point. Very good point.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Christine. All really important. And I think also this point about, you can layer many guidelines and many requirements on, but there has to be an appreciation for the reality as well. And I think a number of panelists have emphasized that. And I know that that's a gap that the self-assessment guide is also aiming to address. I want to start bringing in some of the questions that we're getting from our audience, as we're nearing the end of our event. And Alejandro, I would like to turn back to you. We have a question from one audience member about the militarization of police, and having seen that as a trend in Latin America specifically, where there are really militant threats the police are facing, and so I'm wondering, if you can tell us a little bit about the work that I know that your organization is also doing to try to regulate police use of lethal and less lethal weapons in this context. Can you talk just a little bit about why that's important, this idea of regulating the type of equipment and weapons police are using, and what progress you're seeing in this space in the context of concerns about militarization of the police?
Sí, súper. Bueno, tuvimos un contexto importante que hay que traerlo acá, y es que en el año 2020 todos los ciudadanos colombianos amanecimos con un video viral en donde aparecía un policía con un taser torturando a un ciudadano que después, posteriormente, fue asesinado al interior de un CAI. Esta imagen apareció el 8 de septiembre muy temprano en la mañana, y en la tarde la ciudadanía salió a quemar los CAIs, un poco para contextualizar qué es un CAI. Un CAI es una unidad estática, que es donde se prestan servicios policiales. La ciudadanía acude a ellos a denunciar múltiples cosas, y son casetas que están en el espacio público, dirigidos a la atención ciudadana, en donde la gente va a poner denuncias. Estos lugares, en el marco de la pandemia, se habían convertido en centros de reclusión transitoria, digamos, para personas y ciudadanías en riesgo de exclusión social. Entonces, al ver este video, hubo unas protestas muy violentas de la ciudadanía, en donde salieron a quemar literalmente estos espacios. Y no contábamos en ese momento con esta fuerza disponible, que aquí se llama SMAD, o acaban de cambiarle el nombre y hoy se llama un demo, pero en sus países son estos cuerpos policiales que se visten como Robocops y que utilizan armamentos menos letales. Y no había suficiente cuerpo disponible de esta fuerza disponible y quienes tuvieron que atender esta crisis pues tan grave de estas protestas violentas fueron policías de patrullaje, es decir, policías que utilizan revólver y no armamentos menos letales. La consecuencia, digamos, de la utilización de este armamento, del armamento del arma de fuego, fue que 12 personas terminaron asesinadas en esa noche por parte de la policía. Entonces, esto habría una discusión muy grande en el país sobre la utilización, digamos, de las fuerzas policiales atendiendo protestas, las fuerzas que no están capacitadas y que no cuentan con armamentos letales, y también como toda la restricción también de estas armas menos letales. Ahorita, uno de los grandes logros de la negociación que hubo entre la sociedad civil y el gobierno nacional fue restringir rotundamente las balas de goma. Las balas de goma son estos armamentos que han generado, digamos, unas lesiones muy graves. Durante el paro nacional nosotros documentamos alrededor de 103 pérdidas oculares, 103 lesiones oculares en donde jóvenes recibieron un disparo directo en el ojo. Entonces, este contexto lo cuento un poco por varias razones, porque por un lado nosotros desde Temblores sí creemos que debe haber una fuerza disponible que atienda de una manera pues idónea y disperse movilizaciones que se tornan violentas, es decir, creemos que sí debe haber un cuerpo que pueda dispersar una movilización que se volvió violenta y sí debe haber cierto grado y cierta utilización de armamentos menos letales. Lo que sucede es que estos armamentos menos letales tienen muy poca regulación o las regulaciones que tienen dependen mucho de la orden de turno del comandante. Entonces nosotros hemos venido identificando cómo hay comandantes que en el paro nacional dieron la orden directa de atacar directamente el pecho y la cara de los manifestantes en vez de realizar estos disparos parabólicos. Las policías dispararon directamente al pecho y a la cabeza de los manifestantes. Entonces, por un lado, sí creemos que hay que restringir el uso de estos armamentos, es decir, por ejemplo, lanzar un gas lacrimógeno en una plaza pública llena de 40.000 personas, pues implica unos riesgos muy grandes para la ciudadanía. Las de goma de una manera no parabólica o dispararlas indistinta e indiscriminadamente contra los cuerpos de la ciudadanía también representa un riesgo para la integridad y la vida muy grande. Entonces yo sí creo que hay que, por un lado, construir unos protocolos más serios respetando estos tratados internacionales contra la tortura, en donde se restrinja la utilización de este tipo de armamentos. Estos armamentos nosotros los hemos llamado políticamente no armamentos de letalidad reducida, sino armamentos potencialmente letales, porque en los últimos 3 años hemos visto cómo han terminado con la vida de personas y han dañado, digamos, la integridad de muchas ciudadanías. Entonces, por un lado, sí creo que hay que regular los espacios en donde estos armamentos deben ser utilizados y también creo que no deben ser atendidas las protestas por grupos policiales de patrullaje, que fue lo que sucedió, digamos, en el país cuando no contábamos con la suficiente fuerza disponible. Y algo en lo que hemos insistido es que hay alrededor de 18 espacios en donde esta fuerza interviene. Entonces puede haber una azonada, un motín, una movilización violenta, unos actos vandálicos. Y yo sí creo que para cada uno de esos espacios hay que determinar y hacer un estudio del arma específica que se puede utilizar. Y no, digamos, salir a proteger la movilización con múltiples armamentos y que quede a discrecionalidad de la gente, del propio agente, qué tipo de arma debe utilizar, porque eso es lo que nos ha llevado, digamos, pues, a pérdidas de vidas y a daños a la integridad. Entonces, sí creemos que hay que fortalecer los protocolos y también, pues, formar a los agentes en temas de derechos humanos. Por ejemplo, en las marchas feministas salieron un montón de Robocops hombres a atender, digamos, todas estas protestas y también pues se generaron una serie de violencias contra las mujeres en estos espacios hace poco en este año ya bajo el nuevo gobierno.
Yeah, many thanks, Alejandro. And also, I think just for bringing together again these topics that I know are in the self-assessment guide of equipment, how it's used, training and preparation, and back to what Christine said also about having alternatives and really thinking carefully about escalation. Commissioner Karkas, I'd like to come back to you once more. We have a question from someone in the audience also about really thinking about now increasingly the role of youth, the role of the younger generation in demonstrations. And you talked in your earlier intervention about the importance of how you police public assemblies, because this is such a visible role for the police to play. And so I'm wondering whether you would like to share any other insights related to, how you think police capabilities can be strengthened to make sure that the police can help to manage public assemblies, demonstrations peacefully, especially when younger people, when youth are involved in these events.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Donc, en réaction avec votre question, qui s'articule autour des efforts qui sont déployés par les unités constituées dans le cadre de la gestion des manifestations, j'aimerais bien parler d'un sujet qui est très important, les manifestations qui sont sportives. Donc, ces manifestations, ils connaissent le déploiement d'un dispositif qui est étoffé, et afin de garantir la sécurité optimale lors de ces événements, comme il est le cas pour un match de football, plusieurs actions doivent être entamées préalablement avant le début de la dite manifestation, et ce, en vue d'éviter tout débordement ou incident qui peut porter atteinte à l'ordre public, et ce, en adoptant plusieurs mesures. Donc, parmi ces mesures, l'on peut citer et qui s'inscrivent dans le cadre des attributions qui sont confiées aux forces de l'ordre ainsi qu'aux responsables hiérarchiques à tous les niveaux. Donc, la tenue de réunions et de coordination avec les différents intervenants du corps sécuritaire, des responsables des équipements du stade qui va abriter le match, les sociétés aussi qui sont chargées de la gestion et de la vente des billets du match, ce dans le cadre d'une approche qui est participative. Aussi, des études préalables sont menées en vue d'étudier l'estimation du nombre de supporters devant assister à la rencontre à travers une concertation étroite avec les entités policières des villes auxquelles les supporters peuvent faire un mouvement ou un déplacement. Donc, c'est une chose qui est très essentielle dans le cadre de la gestion de tels événements. Aussi, il y a une chose qui est très importante, c'est que l'actualisation des bases de données relatives aux personnes interdites d'accéder au stade, une chose qui est très importante, à travers laquelle on peut éviter plusieurs incidents qui peuvent être au niveau du dit match. Effectuer des visites préalables aussi au stade qui va abriter la manifestation sportive en vue d'étudier et examiner les vices de sécurité pouvant engendrer d'éventuelles pertes ou dégâts. Donc, c'est une chose qui est très essentielle dans le cadre de la gestion d'un tel événement. Assurer les gares ferroviaires et routières par le renforcement du dispositif de sécurité mis en place en la circonstance, en prévision de l'arrivée des supporters. C'est une chose qui est aussi essentielle. Parmi les points aussi essentiels, la mise en place lors de la journée coïncidant avec l'événement d'un dispositif de sécurité au niveau des accès du stade, ses alentours, au niveau de ses enceintes. Donc, quant aux forces de l'ordre dans le cadre de cet événement, il y a plusieurs mesures, dont des écrits qui doivent être adressés aux différentes entités afin de les sensibiliser quant à l'importance de cet événement, tout en définissant les tâches et les missions qui leur sont dévolues dans ce cadre. Aussi, Il faut effectuer des opérations de fouille au niveau des portes d'accès pour interdire la détention d'objets de nature douteuse par les supporters. Donc, afin d'interdire des actes de violence qui peuvent entre. Aussi, par mesure de précaution, il faut veiller sur la séparation entre les supporters des deux équipes qui vont se confronter pour éviter tout accrochage ou acte de violence réciproque. Donc, la mise en place aussi d'un plan de gestion de la circulation pour assurer sa fluidité aux alentours du stade abritant la rencontre ou l'événement. Aussi, dans ce contexte, ici est de rappeler que le personnel dépendant de la DGSN est déployé dans le cadre de tels dispositifs reçoivent des séances qui sont consacrées à des simulations, donc des simulations qui sont faites avant le match pour étudier les scénarios et ainsi étudier même les plans d'évacuation préétablis préalablement. Donc, en cas d'évacuation de victimes, en cas d'actes de violence commis à l'enceinte du stade ou à ses alentours. Donc, aussi, le déroulement de l'événement sportivement des conditions pacifiques nécessite une implication de tous les intervenants, notamment ceux du secteur sportif.
Of the stakeholders we have to be in constant coordination with the security heads, but in the case of and also the sports infrastructure facilities are up to code. And let's say there's a change in the facility, it's important to be informed and communicated to have any sort of modification necessary without forgetting the main role to ensure peace and also proper conduct to have by the agents of police when they are maybe provoked. I'm losing him, I'm sorry. And how to respond to certain complicated situations, how to keep calm, and also always focus on communication prior to use of force. These are some of the main ideas related to the questions that you have asked. Thank you very much. And I'm available to you for any other question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent. Really for that clear overview, and I think also what you emphasized in your previous intervention, how you prepare members of the police to keep calm, and to respond effectively and proportionally also. So as much as I hate to begin wrapping up this discussion, that is now what we need to do. I am not going to attempt to summarize what has been a wide-ranging and really, really interesting conversation. I think it's more interesting if our panel members do that. So I would like to ask each of our panel members now to, in less than 1 minute, please, as briefly as possible, just share with us, one thing you take away from today's discussion, one point of learning, or one thing, you would really like our audience members to walk away with and to remember today. And Christine, I will turn to you first for your key takeaway from today.
Thank you. I think my key takeaway from today is to understand the context you're operating under, and also to make sure that it depends on the role you have, but you need to know your legal framework. And then I'm as I said several times, I think this training, because training gives confidence. And if you're confident you can solve situations in many different ways, then maybe sometimes you don't need the extensive force. So I think this is, and also the how different the world is, which I've been listening to my colleagues now all around the world. I think this is my greatest takeaway today, that we need to work together and to understand. And I see this also being a part of peacekeeping. So now I'm and I have 50 different police contributing countries here in UNPOL in UNMISS. So I really see we did discuss how different backgrounds we come from. I think this will do. I have many takeaways. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Christine. Louise, what are your key takeaways?
Thanks very much, Abby. So my key takeaway is a discussion that was had, I guess, a bit between Mark and Christine, and something I would have touched on if I had more time. And it's that question of how we translate normative standards and these higher laws into operational language that the police understand. And so my key takeaway is that we've often seen the most success in terms of this in our own work, working at that level of the standard operating procedure. So reviewing and reforming that, it doesn't fix fundamental deficits in the overarching legal framework, but it often speaks to a language that the beat police officers or those responding to gatherings, etc., understand. And so just ensuring that we're not limiting our discourse on this issue to those higher level laws, but looking at police practice and policy through those procedures. But thank you for the opportunity to be part of the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Louise. That's really, really helpful. Alejandro, over to you. What is your key takeaway or lesson from today's discussion?
Aprendido.
No, yo creo que para
Okay, so to close, I think that for maybe 5 years back and after the murder of George Floyd, I think that the police started doing a big structural change because these were very big in the whole globe. So we have to make changes in the part of security. And one of the things is that to make the perfection, that part of transparency, to be able to give account to the different citizens and to the justice systems. And I think that this is the main points that we have to reform so we can reconstruct that culture between citizens and police, and that it was going to be repairing all of this situation in which the police is going to be more closer to the citizen and also for the human rights.
Great, thank you. Mark, over to you for your concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Abby. Well, I have 3 takeaways. Actually, communications, communications, and communications. I think we've spoken all about that, about sending messages, but also receiving them, listening, how important it is for all of us to listen. Christine was talking about getting out on the street to listen and understand police. We need to convey our messages clearly in our policies and develop communication by command leadership. We need to convey our messages in law enforcement appropriately. We hope and pray the news media will convey messages appropriately. So it's all about communications. But to use the last 20 seconds of my time, Abby, is to thoroughly commend DCAF for publishing this self-assessment guide. I see it as a way for law enforcement agencies and those of us in police leadership to look in the mirror and self-assess. It is an excellent tool, and I commend DCAF for producing it. I thoroughly recommend it. I thank Gary and Natalie for the presentation that you made effectively, but I think for all of us to actually get it, read it, assess it, and consider how it might be used in our agencies, very, very important. So thank you for producing it. I totally recommend it. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And Commissioner Carcas, over to you in 1 minute or less for your key takeaway or lesson from today's conversation.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the colleagues for the information and those lessons that have been shared regarding the use of force in the framework of the management of manifestations or demonstrations. And we talk about the need, the main role that is played by the police. I would also like to thank DCAF for your organization of this webinar that is very fruitful. And I would also like to communicate with you, to share with you that the publication that has been presented has enormous value for police forces and when it comes to managing demonstrations. Thank you for the invitation. And that is all that I have to add. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Very much appreciated, Commissioner. And with that, I will say a big thank you to all of our panel members and our presenters and our audience members, and turn it over to Cristina Hoyos, the head of DCAF's Latin America and the Caribbean units, for closing remarks and to close our session today. Cristina, over to you.
Well, Abby, thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, for this excellent discussion that really contributes to the debate of the governance of use of force. I think it was a very rich discussion. And as Abby said already, rather than summarizing all the contributions that we have heard today, from all these different kinds of set of backgrounds, I would like to highlight only a few points. First of all, the use of force by the police has been a very sensitive and controversial topic, as we have heard today. And this has been debated worldwide for several decades. While the primary goal of the police is to protect and serve the community, the way use of force is applied can have enormous impact of trust and confidence of the society in public institutions. As we have listened today, the excessive use of force can lead to human rights violations. Therefore, it is necessary to have the appropriate framework where principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality in which law enforcement institutions are held accountable. And precisely to fill this gap, DCAF has developed this practical guide which apply human rights approach to address this critical issue. Rather than providing prescriptions or directions, DCAF aims to advance a self-reflecting processes that inform decision-making according to each specific context. I think today we have heard so many contexts, and this is exactly what we want to see, is that the guide that we have presented today intends really to prompt this self-reflection, which is very important to align police use of force more closely with human rights standards and international good practice, which is part of a wider reform process where changes precisely in norms, culture, and behaviors can really take place. We are aware of many differences that exist among countries and institutions, and this is why the guide has been designed in a very sensitive, pragmatic, and flexible fashion to conduct an internal structured analysis of national police institutions and their partners in translating international norms and national legal frameworks into a day-to-day practices in policing. I think all the comments from Mark and from Christine are going exactly in that way, and Louise, to really have a practical and pragmatical tool that could be operationalized. As we have heard today, to create the adequate accountability structures is key to involve whole system of stakeholders, including oversight institutions, civil society, local and national governments, and lawmakers. The civil society supports and ombuds institutions could play a key role if there is a constructive dialogue from all sides, where specifically security of the people is at the core of all engagements. The role of international partnerships is also key in this context. And DCAF supports police organizations in all the regions, including the MENA region, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Asian Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa. We look forward to supporting our partners as they continue to make progress in strengthening the rule of law, protection of human rights, and hopefully implement this guide. Very soon, we will be launching this guide in French and in Arabic to reach out to other stakeholders worldwide. And many thanks to the authors, Natalia Escobar, Gary White, and our moderator, Abby Robinson, for their excellent work. And I would like to mention as well Maria Gonzalez, who has been part of the team, and all the panel members for sharing your experience, your points of view, your expertise, and everyone who has joined us today for this excellent discussion. Thank you very much.